I think it's great.
We have such sights to show you.
Hello, it's been a long time, been about a couple weeks. I'm very much behind on a lot of reviews, but I figure I'll take a special time to talk about one specific film that I saw recently, and that is the Kickstarter documentary In Search of Darkness, the definitive 80s horror documentary. This is a documentary that has been in the works for about the last year and a half or so, having a huge following on Kickstarter and leading up to its eventual release pretty soon. And now it's been released digitally on Vimeo and some other platforms. I'm not entirely sure. I should also clarify that the person who put this all together is director and writer David A. Weiner, or Weiner. Okay, please don't sue me if I got the name wrong. This is a film that I pre-ordered about a couple months ago, and I supported the film, and I tweeted about the film for a while. And now I finally got to see it, all 4.5 hours worth. And this is a pretty daunting documentary, because when you have a documentary that is saying that it's the definitive version of any sort of documentary about film history, it can seem very anticlimactic when you don't have the entirety of anything. I mean, of course it's not going to talk about every single movie out of every single year of the 1980s. It's just impossible. So what the film manages to do instead is touch upon the cornerstones of each year while also providing some context and insight into some films that you may not have heard of before. I mean, who has heard of the film The Stuff? I mean, it's a film about killer ice cream. I've never heard of a film like that before. It's weird. But yeah, of course, the film also touches upon things like, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, the pantheon of slashers, the transformations of people into werewolves and cats in films like The Howling or The American Werewolf in London. They talk about so many films in this movie, and with the 4-hour and 30-minute running time, you can really, on face value, assume that the film would become monotonous with just talking about every single film one after the other. But what the film manages to do instead is that they split up the film in a way that makes it much more digestible. So instead of just going year after year after year, they instead have 1 year presented, and then they have a topic that they discuss for about 5 to 10 minutes. So things like horror sound, horror music, special effects makeup, the origins and the rise of the final girl. So many different topics related to the horror movie genre that really help to bring a lot more context to how horror changed in the 1980s and what it eventually has become in the modern day in terms of homage and some other different aspects. It brings a lot of context and sort of fulfillment of what these yearly, dissections were lacking, which is a full sort of contextual breakdown of every year in horror and how it relates to society of the times. Now, the film does actually have moments where it talks about certain things and how certain movies were played for, societal things. Things like They Live as a message on consumerism and how messages are reinforced through things like advertisements. What do these advertisements actually tell you to do? It says, consume. An advertisement is basically a sign for us to consume something. But there's plenty of other different discussions that they also talk about. The rise of the final girl, for example, being both a symbol of empowerment as well as a symbol of, some other things as well. They talk so much about how horror has affected society and how society has affected horror and changed it in so many different ways. One thing that I forgot to mention about is the film's soundtrack, the soundtrack being from a group called the Weary Pines. The film's soundtrack is really well produced from Weary Pines, and what better way to get to talk about something from the 80s than to envelop the listener and viewer into the world of the 80s using a synthesized soundtrack that really engrosses you and pulls you into the narrative of the story. For as much as this film talks about a lot of different films, I feel like for certain films, they don't necessarily get a lot of dissection, and it leads me to actually classify this documentary as something of a wholly new thing in documentary filmmaking. And that is what I'm going to lovingly coin the term the encyclopedia documentary. Now, an encyclopedia, is basically a book that has a lot of different, chapters and subsections about different topics. And this movie is essentially a huge encyclopedia movie where they talk about different movies, and if you want to actually learn more about these types of movies, you can always research it on your own, watch the movie on your own, and it gives you a great sense of kind of movie recommendations you may or may not know you would want to actually watch. There is times where some of the audio is a little inconsistent, mostly because of some people are in a concrete room versus, a controlled environment, and that's not necessarily a huge flaw, it's just more of an audio thing. The film itself, I would say, is well worth it. Unfortunately, it's not easily accessible in two fronts. It's not a very easily accessible film in two fronts. One is that if you're not terribly interested in horror or filmmaking or just learning about film history, this is not a film that's going to appease you much at all. In fact, it might lead to some people to be so bored by it that they'll probably turn it off in the first hour and then come back to it at a later point. Unlike me, who really loves film history and loves to learn more about films that I may or may not know of, it's a film that I pretty much mostly sat through. Aside from, staying up for about a couple hours after I should be going to sleep and having to go to sleep and then watching it the next day, but that's a difference. The other thing is that the point in which I say it's also, not accessible by the majority of the public is that, you can't really buy it on physical media. In fact, right now there is a little bit of an issue, a delay in physical delivery. They've actually had to delay it due to certain things, and that's completely fine. But in terms of viewing it online, it's a little bit tougher to try to find. Although I do believe that, Vimeo has an actual way to have you guys watch it for like a small fee. I'm not entirely sure if that's the case, but if it is the case, let me know. And that is my thoughts really on In Search of Darkness, and it's really well crafted. It is lovingly put together. It's well structured. It's a film that flows very well, and in fact, I honestly could see this film turning into something more of a Netflix series where every single season talks about the films of each year in that given decade. It honestly could have made for a very interesting piece of, television, but they had to condense it down to 4.5 hours, and that's fine. And while at times it's not as in-depth as I would have liked it to be, it does give me some film recommendations that if I am curious as to what I want to know more about in terms of what the film is, like, say, The Stuff. If I wanted to explore the movie The Stuff, I could just find a copy of the movie, look up the history behind it, and just do it that way. So, yeah, it's really good, well-structured. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to give In Search of Darkness, the documentary, an A-. Thank you guys so much for watching my review of In Search of Darkness. I can't wait to talk about all the other films I've missed for the past 2.5 weeks, so I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.